Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping right up into the dazzling, highly dangerous, and sometimes utterly ridiculous world of poetry. We are looking at Lawrence Ferlinghetti's brilliant poem, Constantly Risking Absurdity. You know, if you've ever thought writing poetry was just, say, sitting quietly at a desk with a warm cup of tea, well, Ferlinghetti is about to completely shatter that image for you. He actually frames the writing of poetry as a metaphorical circus act. It's this perilous, death-defying performance where literally one wrong move means complete disaster.
Here is our playbill for today's show. First, we'll meet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Then we'll look at the poet as acrobat, followed by balancing on audience gaze. Next up is tricks, illusion, and truth, and finally, catching beauty in midair. Let's get into it. Section 1. Meet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the Beat Generation and City Lights. Okay, let's dive right in and meet the mind behind this high-wire poetic act. To really grasp the gravity of this poem, we've got to ground ourselves in Ferlinghetti's history first. Living an incredible life from 1919 all the way to 2021, Ferlinghetti was an American poet, painter, and a fierce activist. He's incredibly famous for founding the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco back in 1953, which quickly became the absolute beating heart of the Beat Generation and the counterculture movement. The Beat poets were rebels. They actively fought against that idealized, buttoned-up conformity of the 1950s. Instead of playing by rigid rules, their poetry was all about exploration, free-flowing forms, and raw, unfiltered emotion inspired by a pretty chaotic world. His 1958 collection, A Coney Island of the Mind, which is where this poem comes from, perfectly captures that wildly expressive, unconventional spirit. Section 2. The Poet as Acrobat, Establishing the Extended Metaphor. Now that we know where he's coming from, let's step into the center ring and look at the poem's core theme. Just take a look at these spectacular acrobats for a second. What does it actually take to do what they do? Immense agility, right? Unbelievable physical strength, perfect discipline and balance. But most importantly, it takes a willingness to risk an absolute catastrophic fall. Ferlinghetti anchors this extended metaphor on our minds to show us that the poet is exactly the same. Writing isn't safe. It requires immense mental agility, concentration, and the constant risk of absurdity. By that, he means the risk of failure, of public ridicule, or just creating something totally meaningless. It is a very high-stakes game. Now, what's really interesting here is how the visual layout of the poem itself actually becomes part of the performance. Look at these first 5 lines. Constantly risking absurdity and death whenever he performs above the heads of his audience. Notice the enjambment. The way the sentence just spills over from one line to the next without any punctuation. And look at that staggered, uneven line spacing. The text literally mimics a precarious tightrope walker, or maybe someone slipping and falling through the air. The form of the poem perfectly matches the dangerous, unbalanced meaning of the words. And when he says the poet performs above the heads, it's not just physical height. It implies the very real danger that his profound poetry might just go completely over the heads of his audience, leaving him looking, well, absurd. So how exactly does the poet get up there? Well, he climbs on rhyme. And yeah, that's an older spelling of rhyme, referring to the vowel and everything that follows it in a syllable. The poet builds his high wire entirely out of words. What you should really take away from this is that the immense difficulty of poetry is completely self-imposed. Nobody is forcing the poet up there into the rafters. He climbs on rhyme to a high wire of his own making. If he falls, if he fails to make art, he has absolutely no one to blame but himself. Section 3. Balancing on audience gaze, the sea of faces. So the crucial point here is that this self-imposed tightrope walk doesn't just happen in a vacuum. A performer needs an audience. Let's look at lines 9 through 12. The poet is balancing on I-beams, above a sea of faces. Just imagine that for a second. His only support structure is the gaze of the audience. Every successful artist relies entirely on the response of their readers or their critics. Without them looking, the performance doesn't even exist. But calling the audience a sea of faces makes them seem completely anonymous, faceless, and overwhelmingly huge. It really underscores the profound isolation and the terrifying exposure of creating art. The poet is elevated, entirely alone, and supported only by the precarious attention of strangers. And as he balances, notice the phrasing here. He paces his way to the other side of day. The deliberate, slow rhythm of those words literally mimics the careful, thoughtful work of the poet. One wrong step, and it's over. But it's also a beautiful metaphor for the whole purpose of art.
The poet is trying to move us beyond ordinary, everyday reality, the other side of day, and into a much deeper world of imagination and profound understanding. Section 4. Tricks, Illusion, and Truth, the Technical Feats of Poetry. To actually make it to that other side, the poet needs a robust, complex set of skills. Let's open up his technical toolbox. Ferlinghetti throws in this absolutely fantastic word here, entrechats. It's actually a ballet term for these incredibly fast, repeated jumps where the dancer crosses and uncrosses their feet in midair. He also mentions sleight of foot tricks, which instantly brings up connotations of magic and deception. Now you might be wondering, why use ballet and magic to talk about poetry? Well, it links the creation of poems to highly technical, agile, and deceptively complex art forms. A truly great poet has to know all the tricks of language to layer meaning so effortlessly that it just looks like magic to the rest of us. And this brilliantly illustrates the poet's ultimate dilemma. On one hand, you have illusion and deception, the sleight of foot tricks and high theatrics needed to dazzle the audience. But on the other side, the poet is a super realist searching for authentic truth, or what Ferlinghetti calls the taut truth. The poet has to use these deceptive illusions and linguistic tricks without ever mistaking them for reality. The profound responsibility of the poet is to use the tricks to actually cut through appearances and expose the raw, authentic core of what it really means to be human. To hammer home how serious this is, Ferlinghetti writes that the poet must perforce perceive this truth. Perforce basically means necessarily or inevitably, because there is absolutely no other choice. Feel the intense, sharp alliteration in those words: perforce, perceive, taut truth. The harsh P and T sounds add this undeniable tension. It reveals that for the poet, seeing and writing the truth isn't just a fun hobby. It is an inescapable necessity that's executed under immense pressure. Section 5. Catching Beauty in Midair, the Ultimate Leap. Let's move along and see how this builds into the tense, breathtaking climax of the poem. The poet keeps advancing toward that still higher perch. And this is just a fantastic pun. A perch is the physical platform an acrobat aims for, sure, but it's also a stance or a point of view. By saying it's a still higher perch, Ferlinghetti suggests that the pursuit of artistic perfection is completely endless. There is no final resting place for the true artist. The poet is never truly satisfied. There is always a deeper truth, a better poem, a higher level of mastery waiting just out of reach. So, who exactly is waiting on that higher perch? Take a look at the full layout of the poem here. Down near the bottom, you can see where Beauty stands and waits with gravity to start her death-defying leap. Beauty is brilliantly personified here as a female trapeze artist waiting to be caught. And whatever you do, don't miss the genius pun on the word gravity. It means immense seriousness, of course, but it's also the literal physical force pulling them down toward a deadly fall. To attain true beauty in art, you have to risk everything against the gravity that wants to pull you down into failure. Okay, so the tension is at its absolute peak. Beauty leaps. The poet gets ready to make the catch. But look at this acrobat, covering his face in fear or anticipation. In this monumental, death-defying moment, the poet is suddenly reduced from a master of the high wire to a highly vulnerable, terrified participant. Ferlinghetti actually describes him in this final moment as a little Charlie Chaplin man. Obviously, that's a reference to the famous silent film actor Charlie Chaplin, whose iconic character was the small, clumsy, often absurd, but deeply human and tragicomic figure. By dropping this illusion right at the climax, Ferlinghetti beautifully exposes the fragile humanity of the poet. He isn't some flawless god up there. He's just a clumsy little guy trying desperately to perform the impossible, absurd task of catching beauty's eternal, perfect form. And where does this all take place? It happens spread-eagled in the empty air of existence. And man, this is the tragic irony of the ending. The poet throws his entire soul onto the line, risking failure, absurdity, and artistic death just to catch beauty. And he does it in an empty air that offers absolutely no guarantees of a safety net, no guarantee of applause, and honestly, no inherent meaning. It proves that dedicating your life to art is a dangerous, incredibly vulnerable, and often entirely thankless endeavor. Which brings us to the final, lingering question of this explainer. Does the poet catch beauty, or does he just fall into the empty air of existence? Well, Ferlinghetti purposely doesn't tell us. He says the poet may or may not catch her. It's an entirely ambiguous ending that leaves the artist perpetually suspended on the wire. Every time a poet writes, every single time you put a creative piece of yourself out into the world, you are taking that leap, constantly risking absurdity, never knowing if you're going to catch beauty or plummet. What do you think happens to the acrobat? It's a question that's going to stay with you long after the circus tent comes down.